Zebulun, Elon, I, the Tetragrammaton, the Lord God Most High, I do exercise thee and do powerfully command thee, O Spirit. Elon, I, the Tetragrammaton, the Lord God Most High, I do exercise thee and do powerfully command.
In the dark shadows, in the white cold, fearlessly we search for knowledge new and old. We drink the strong spirits and read the ancient tomes. The order of the Abracast. We are the brave and the bold. Occult, history, conspiracy, and violence.
Hey everybody, welcome to the end of the world. This is John Towers, and I am John Towers, and this is the Abracast. So, we've been talking about what's going on in Ukraine and Russia, and here at home quite a bit. So this is an update onto that. I've dug up some interesting articles we're going to go over, and before we get started, I just want to... Well, I want to get this party started right is what I want to do. So here we go. I got my visual of the art. Check out the storefront on Abracast.com. And I have an alternate weapon of mass distraction in here. Today I'm struggling to get on schedule and to get consistent for you guys after my little nervous breakdown or whatever the fuck happened to me for the last few months. And want to thanks again for those of you guys who reached out to check on me. I really appreciate that. Got the best listeners out there. So here we go. Here's to you. Here's the whatever. Let's not burn up in a thermonuclear exchange, mutually assured destruction. So we just reached we're just over the year anniversary of this particular invasion of Ukraine. So I want to talk a little bit, get into this article here. Look at me getting right into it. This is from thehill.com. Is Ukraine the war before the war? This is by Michael Sang. This is not that old, February 23rd. When Russia began its effort to conquer Ukraine 1 year ago, there was every reason to believe the end result would be disastrous for the West. Moscow had Kiev outgunned and vastly outmanned. The West had done little in response to the previous Russian land grabs in Georgia 2008 and Ukraine in 2014. Thanks, Obama. And the European economy was in thrall to Russian energy. If somehow we did muster the courage to push back, surely the result would be a NATO-Russian war, perhaps a nuclear war. Or so the thinking went at that time. The Russian invasion of Ukraine is a heinous crime, which the whole world would have been better off without. Yet it has gone far better for Ukraine than any could have hoped at this time last year, thanks to both the Ukrainian bravery on the battlefield and on the home front, and perhaps surprising level of Western resolve and materiel assistance. And thanks for the billions of your tax dollars shipped over to Ukraine to be laundered to politicians, I suspect. What's more, the war for all its miseries, could prove to hold unexpected benefit for the U.S. national security. It has revealed much about the West's strengths and vulnerabilities. These lessons can help prepare us for, or better yet, prevent the next great power conflict. We should choose to heed them. The most important of these lessons is that the West will totally ignore Chinese spy balloons floating over their nuclear sites. The most important of these lessons is that our politicians will break the law and blow up pipelines expounding metric tons of natural gas into the environment. The most important of these lessons is that the West has both the will and the capacity to stand up to nuclear-armed power bent on territorial aggrandizement, something that was not at all obvious at the war's beginning. To be sure, the task in Ukraine is far from finished, and it's vital that the West help Kiev bring the war to a victorious conclusion. But just as important as is that we consider how we could replicate the relative success of the past year in other scenarios, most crucially China, if it were to attempt to seize Taiwan. Now, ironically, I'm not trying to make this any more confusing than it already has to be, but Washington Free Beacon has report U.S. sending hundreds of troops to Taiwan as China threatens invasion. The U.S. military is sending up to 200 troops to Taiwan. Is that number right? We're sending 200 troops to Taiwan as the country faces a political Chinese invasion, a move that comes amid heightened tensions between Washington and Beijing. Officials say that the military is preparing to send between 100 and 200 troops to Taiwan, building on the 30 troops deployed there last year, according to the Wall Street Journal. The decision is part of a training program intended to reinforce Taiwanese defense against China, making the largest deployment of forces in decades by the U.S. on Taiwan, the Journal reported. We don't have a comment on the specific operations, engagements, or training, but I would highlight that our support for and the defense in the relationship with Taiwan remains aligned against the current threat posed by the People's Republic of China. Lieutenant Colonel Marty Miners, Defense Department spokesman, told Fox News the Michigan National Guard is also helping to train part of the Taiwanese military. So there we go. There we go. Back to our original The Hill article. This means not simply ensuring that Taiwan has the means to defend itself and that the U.S. is positioned to come meaningfully to its aid, but that Taiwan supporters in the West have prepared for the economic consequences of a conflict in Asia, which would dwarf those of the Ukraine war. The U.S. and its partners must plan not only to oppose economic pressure on China, but to protect themselves from Beijing's own economic leverage. We should focus first on inputs such as mining of rare earth materials, which are vital to the high-tech defense industries and depend almost entirely on Chinese supply chains. That would be impossible to quickly replace in times of conflict. Taken together, such steps not only would enhance Western readiness to respond to a Chinese move on Taiwan, but ideally deter Beijing from making the attempt. So let's talk a little bit about what this guy's saying here. When we left Afghanistan in the total clown show circus way that we did, one of the first things the Taliban did is sell their mineral rights to China. So this person talking about how that we're even prepared to deal with this in any kind of way is ridiculous. Let's also talk about the fact that we are currently selling and not replenishing our strategic oil reserve. The strategic oil reserve is there, for when we send troops places. When we need to send the people that need to blow things up and kill people overseas to do that, That's what the strategic oil reserve is for. We're currently selling it. That's why our gas prices are relatively low for the time being. But they're not too low. They're not too low because we're not replenishing it because the gas prices are too high. Circular logic. During the Ukrainian conflict, the West's efforts to isolate Russia have been hampered by a lack of support from partners outside North America and Europe. These states have largely accepted Russia's framing of the conflict as pitting Moscow against NATO, when in reality it is a war of naked aggression against Ukraine. They also reject efforts by the West to cast the war in moral terms instead of prioritizing their own national interest, which in many cases have been well served by buying up Russian oil made cheaper by Western sanctions. The problem of recruiting such states to our side, including vital powers such as Turkey, India, and Saudi Arabia, in a conflict involving China would be even more acute given Beijing's dominant role in global trade. Persuading them will require casting aside talk of with us or against us or value-based coalitions and instead identifying narrower actions they can take, which serve rather than undermine their interests, making clear to them the economic consequences of a conflict in Asia may lead them to urge Beijing to forswear a move on Taiwan. And while a wealthy state such as the United Arab Emirates may be reluctant to broadly condemn Beijing, it is far likelier to finance rare earth mines, chip fabrication facilities, and other ventures outside of China ahead of any conflict. Steps that will mean far more than any vote in the United Nations General Assembly. The second key lesson of the Ukraine war is that the West militaries were not ready for it. For all the attention paid to Germany's decision about sending its Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine, the lion's share of military aid in Ukraine is provided by who? Us. The perception that this assistance has undercut America's readiness for conflicts elsewhere is a key factor in waning support the war effort among some Republicans, which may prove to be a significant factor in determining the conflict's course this year and next. The harsh reality, however, is that the U.S. defense industry would not be ready for a conflict in Asia even without the diversion of materiel to Ukraine. Recent war games suggest the U.S. would run out of precision-guided munitions within a few weeks of such a war. Let's also not fail to mention that we are modifying and sending a bunch of our M1 Abrams battle tanks to Ukraine. That is the main battle tank of the United States Army. This thing is one of the reasons that we are dominant. It is able to move a large amount of firepower very quickly because it has a fucking jet engine in it. I've been around these things, and they're just awesome. They're fantastic. And I believe what they're doing is they're taking the jet engine out and they're putting a diesel engine in them and sending them over to Ukraine. So another problem is that there's a classified aspect of its armor. It has something to do with depleted uranium, I believe. So I think they're taking off the depleted uranium armor as well. So they're getting like I got it. They're getting like a GoBots version of our tanks, not the Transformers version. They're getting the GoBots version. So where does that leave us as far as readiness is concerned? Let's see. Are we even training our military people on how to kill things and blow shit up anymore? Whenever I read about them, they're all talking about pronouns and how they're not allowed to call their drill sergeants sirs anymore or whatever. it's a silly state of affairs we find ourselves in here. In the Western world, and this is the sort of stuff that Putin railed against recently, where he's like, "Look, we can't do shit like the Americans are doing. They're all pedophiles and they're all gender confused and they're all Satanists." Even a reinvigorated U.S. defense industrial base will not be sufficient to supply the West in the event of more than one major conflict. Nevertheless, the need for vigilance against Russian aggression will not diminish, even as the chance conflict in Asia increases. The upshot of these realities is that it is vital that Europe be ready to assume a greater role in its own security. This means not simply sending more on the defense in parallel with the United States, but invigorating in its defense industry so that sort of systems that only Washington can provide today, which is most of them, needn't be shipped across the Atlantic. Some worry that a stronger European defense industry and capability will threaten NATO. In fact, it may be vital to NATO's continued credibility, which I don't think it has a whole lot. Should the United States need to more seriously turn its attention to Asia? Looking back at decades hence, it may be that the Ukrainian conflict is remembered as the war before the war, a conflict that prefigured other sharper conflagrations amid the turbulent 21st century. If so, the course of those subsequent wars may depend on whether the West heeds the lessons from this one. So here we go. This has been sort of kind of like a rose lens sort of view at what's going on, and I'm not sure if it even though it is kind of an opinion piece, I'm not sure if it's intellectually honest with its readers. You be the judge. As far as like this chip stuff is concerned, I bug out because of India and China is making a lot of our medicine, and I'm like, that's bad news for me. Not necessarily for me personally, but if certain mental health drugs are become harder and harder to get, which is a problem that we had in microcosm during COVID, the COVID supply chain issues. If those become harder and harder to get, like, we're in trouble. A whole lot of people in this country are on these drugs to keep them even, and I'm like, try to figure out like a way to address this, right? And it's like a few years ago, probably 10 years ago by now, Marvel Comics had this storyline, and it was the Initiative, and what they did is the United States government put a superhero team in every state as a QRF, quick response force. So they had like a superhero of like the Texas Avengers and the Great Lakes Avengers and the whatever. But maybe it's something like that we need. Like every state has its own sort of respectable level pharmaceutical company, kind of like how each state has their own, National Guard, right? And then each state can have like their own little chip processing thing. So if we lose a state, we can push the load off to surrounding states or something like that. It's like an initiative, like a Marvel Initiative model. I think that might. I mean, with all this talk about a national divorce where all the red states and blue states are kind of separated, that might help too. If California could build their chips with unicorns and dreams, or however they're gonna do it, and then Ohio can run their chip manufacturing and stuff their way. It's sort of the way, it's the federalist model, right? Okay, I've never heard of this website before, novinti.com. I think that's how you pronounce it. But it has a real short, interesting little piece here. The Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, the title of the piece is Orban, Russia cannot win, but it can start a nuclear war. Viktor Orban believes that Europe has weakened in the last year because of the administration of U.S. President Joe Biden, quote, protects its interests in Brussels to the detriment of European interests. According to him, the consequence of EU sanctions against Russia have begun to weaken the European economy, but have not affected the USA, which is rich in cheap gas. Orban, quoted by Magyar Nemzet, said that during the conflict, Europe lost its independence and its economic and military strength began to weaken because, quote, no one took care, unquote, to restore the reserves of the European army. Viktor Orban specified that the Hungarian government discussed Hungary's attitude to the Ukrainian conflict as a result of the talks. The government has decided to be guided solely by the interests of its own security. Quote, we will not supply weapons. We will not join any military coalition, unquote, he explained. According to Orban, there will be no winners in the conflict in Ukraine. Russia cannot win because the entire Western world supports Ukraine. But Russia is a nuclear power, and a nuclear power cannot be backed into a corner because a nuclear war can start, concluded the Prime Minister. Hungary, remember the episode for a few episodes back, the escalate to de-escalate. This is one of Alexander Dugin and Putin's sort of doctrine to escalate to de-escalate. I believe that's what Orban's talking about here. Hungary takes a neutral position regarding the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. Last summer, it blocked for several weeks the adoption of the embargo on Russian oil in the European Union. The country managed to secure an exemption for itself and will buy Russian oil until 2024. This country's foreign minister, Peter Schlagero, also called on the West to keep communication channels open with Russia. He stated that the sanctions against Russia, quote, have failed because the military actions in Ukraine continued and the economic situation in Europe is deteriorating. All right, we're going to jump over to the AsianTimes.com. World War III is already here. So the way that I've selected to read these articles today, is Ukraine the war before the war? Russia can't win, but it can start a nuclear war. And then here's the third one. World War III is already here. Historians will look back with confusion as to how idiotic the leaders of this time were. This was published February 23rd. And it's got this picture of Biden. It looks like he's sleeping, and Putin's just looking at him smiling. He's just like, this fucking guy. This is going to be so easy. And the caption, I didn't read this before. The caption says, U.S. President Joe Biden and Russian President Vladimir Putin have fumbled into a new world war. It literally, they got a picture of Joe with his eyes closed. It looks like he's taking a nap. It's so funny. Hit the link, and if you don't, hit the link in the show notes just to look at this picture. Putin, it looks like Putin should have like a bib on and a knife and a fork in his hand, like in the old cartoons, like sharpening up the knife. This past week will be remembered by most historians, if anyone is lucky enough to live through this age of self-destruction, as the point of no return for the Russo-Ukrainian war. The world was treated more like tormented by dueling presidential speeches, one from a sclerotic U.S. President Joe Biden, who journeyed to Kiev to reassert his undying support for Ukraine, and the other by surly Russian President Vladimir Putin. Neither speech was partially reassuring. Biden promised his Ukrainian wards an additional $500 million in U.S. taxpayer support for the besieged Ukrainians. Shortly after his speech, the Pentagon hinted that it might stop slow walking its promised but as yet to be delivered M1A2 Abrams main battle tank into the waiting arms of the desperate Ukrainian defenders, and simply hand over the MBTs that are already in America's warehouses, something that the Pentagon had resisted doing when the Biden administration made its initial announcement that it would, in fact, be sending the vaunted MBTs. Remember, these are the GoBot versions, though. They're stripping away the depleted uranium armor, and I believe they're replacing the fucking jet engines that are in these things. Understanding Putin's speech. The other speech came from Putin, who spoke for a whopping 2 hours on Tuesday evening, in which he reiterated his commitment to total victory over Ukraine and how the United States was ruled by Satanists and pedophiles. Unsurprisingly, most Western media outlets simply refused to cover the speech, and those few that did were openly derisive. The speech certainly was Castro-esque in its loquaciousness, and was tinged with quasi-religious accusations against the West that would make the most Iranian mullahs blush. But there was substance to Putin's words. He not only signaled that his commitment to the conflict was as strong as ever, but that he was escalating it. Remember, escalating to de-escalate, in response to what he viewed as American escalation. In fact, Putin ensured that the first significant threat towards the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, he told his American rivals that they were to remove their offensive long-range weapon systems in Ukraine. Otherwise, Russian forces would begin directly targeting those systems. Here is a red line that NATO and the Americans should think twice about crossing. You see, these systems will be used by Ukraine to strike deep inside Russia. And while Ukraine certainly has a right to defend itself, the fact that it is doing so with these capabilities, that it only has to think to the Americans, means the United States and NATO are now, in the eyes of Putin, direct combatants. And I kind of see his point. We're sending tanks, we're sending weapon systems, and we're sending money. He said as much in his speech when he said the Americans will bear the responsibility for these actions should Russia be attacked by such systems. What's more, should these weapon systems be targeted by the Russians, one can anticipate that Americans will die. After all, just as with the Russian S-400 emplacements in Syria, the American long-range systems are undoubtedly staffed or maintained at least partially by Americans. Plus, there are likely American forces operating covertly in and around these long-range weapon systems, so we can expect the Russian targeting of these systems and their surrounding environs will result in multiple American casualties. A key takeaway from these two speeches that were delivered hours apart from each other is that there is now no hope for a peace deal. All right, so I'm going to take a quick detour here to talk about this. Remember the kind of stuff that we talked about before, the escalation to de-escalate, him talking about like, hey, you put these fucking weapon systems in Ukraine, at least partially maintained by Americans in theory. And if one of these things reaches out and touches someone in Europe, the United States is going to be responsible. This is the state. And I don't believe Putin is like our president that just gets up there and just says shit and doesn't know what he's talking about. So I want to talk about this thing called a New START treaty. This is a treaty that was enacted in Obama era. This is an Obama era treaty with Russia. Now listen, the treaty structure: the treaty between the United States of America and the Russian Federation on measures for the further reduction and limitation of strategic offensive arms, also known as the New START treaty, enhances U.S. national security by placing verifiable limits on all Russian deployed intercontinental range nuclear weapons. The United States and Russian Federation have agreed to extend the treaty through February 4th, 2026. This all sounds good, right? This all sounds like good news. Strategic offensive limits. The New START Treaty entered into force on February 5th, 2011. Under the treaty, the United States and Russia Federation had 7 years to meet the treaty's central limits on strategic offensive arms by February 5th, 2018, and are then obliged to maintain those limits for as long as the treaty remains in force. The agreed limits include: both the United States and Russian Federation met central limits of the New START Treaty by February 5th, 2018, and have stayed at or below them ever since. Those limits are 700 deployed intercontinental ballistic missiles, deployed submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and deployed heavy bombers equipped for nuclear armaments. Just 700. 1,550 nuclear warheads on deployed ICBMs, deployed SLBMs, and deployed heavy bombers equipped for nuclear armament, such as heavy bombers, is counted as one warhead towards this limit. 800 deployed and non-deployed ICBM launchers, SLBM launchers, and heavy bombers equipped for nuclear armaments. The New START limits all Russian deployed intercontinental range nuclear weapons, including every Russian nuclear warhead that is loaded onto an intercontinental range ballistic missile that can reach the United States in approximately 30 minutes. It also limits the deployed Avangard and the under-deployed Saramat, the two most operationally available to the Russian Federation's new long-range nuclear weapon that can reach the United States. Extending New START ensures that we will have verifiable limits on the mainstay of Russian nuclear weapons that can reach the U.S. homeland for the next 5 years. As the most recent data exchange on September 1st, 2020, new Russian Federation declared 1,447 deployed strategic warheads. The Russian Federation has a capacity to deploy many more than 1,550 warheads on its modernized ICBMs and SLBMs, as well as the heavy bombers, but is constrained from doing so by New START. The force structure, each party has the flexibility to determine for itself the structure of its force subject to the central limits. The New START Treaty gives the United States the flexibility to deploy and maintain U.S. strategic nuclear forces in a way that best serves the U.S. national security interests. Okay, this thing, this is actually from the U.S. Department of State. They have a little write-up here. I'll throw this link in case you want to read it. But going back to the Asian Times, Putin made the shocking announcement that Russia is withdrawing from the Obama-era New START Treaty, which limits the number of tactical nuclear weapons that both the United States and Russia could have. Of course, the New START Treaty did confer several decisive advantages on the Russian side when the deal was signed by former President Barack Hussein Obama and former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev with Putin's blessing. Remember, these two guys when Obama was running for re-election for a second term, he was sitting down with Medvedev, and they were talking, and this is one of Obama's often unreported hot mic moments where they're getting up and his mic is still on, and he's talking to Dmitry, and he goes, "Hey, tell Vlad I can be a little bit more flexible once the election's over." So, I mean, who's talking about collusion? Collusion? Huh? Still, Russia has a long history of supporting a coterie of arms controls agreements with the Americans going back to the heady Cold War days. For Putin to pull Russia out of the agreement, of which he was a vociferous defender, should raise hairs on the necks of Washington policymakers. Yet, all these statements have done is to harden Washington's zeal in blindly supporting its Ukrainian proxy. Putin's decision to withdraw from the treaty speaks to the depths that he is willing to go to ensure that he wins this war. Thus, compromise is not possible at this rate. The only thing that would make the peace deal tenable for Russia would be if its military were decisively defeated. While the Russians have certainly taken heavy losses, Ukraine has also taken significant losses lately. Unlike the Ukrainians, the Russians can't afford to keep sending hundreds of thousands of their people into the meat grinder until they simply attreat the Ukrainians, until Russia's larger forces bleed Ukrainians' forces dry in the field and then surge over their corpses. This at least appears to be the general Russian plan. If necessary, Putin will deploy tactical nuclear weapons to ensure that his forces can accomplish this Herculean task. The Ukrainians have made their intentions clear since before the conflict erupted a year ago. Kiev wants to complete restoration of Crimea and eventually eastern Ukraine. That too is a red line that, if crossed, will trigger Moscow into risking nuclear war. Russia cannot lose its naval base in Sevastopol. If it does, it ceases being a major power and is isolated away from the vital Black Sea region. The West is living in a pure fantasy if its so-called leadership thinks Putin will simply sit back and watch this unfold. That was the point of Putin's long-winded speech. The war isn't ending. There will be no negotiated settlement, at least not one anytime soon, or one that favors the Western side. For his part, Biden has made clear that he was not only going to continue his support for President Vladimir Zelensky's government of Kiev, but further tweeted upon his departure from Kiev that he had left a part of his heart there. How nice. Biden also committed to the Ukrainian cause that he has thus far refused to respond adequately to a major chemical spill in East Palestine, Ohio, which has been dubbed by many critics as of Biden as America's Chernobyl. I believe we're gonna do a whole thing on this chemical spill business because my style's like a chemical spill. Biden has instead lavishly doled out U.S. tax dollars to a foreign country, Ukraine, instead of fellow Americans suffering in a disaster zone in what is likely the run-up to his re-election campaign for president. If that doesn't show you how far Biden is willing to go for Ukraine, I don't know what will. No peace in our time. Beijing is now getting involved more directly on the side of Moscow, meaning that Russia will have a greater maneuvering room at a time when the West desperately needs the Russians to be isolated. When would Russia seek peace if the war is turning in its favor, as it is? Rather than a deal being hatched, another world war is at hand, made possible by the combined arrogance and ignorance of both Western and Russian leaders who've miscalculated from the very beginning to the ultimate end of the conflict. Just as with the First World War, of course, there will be no victors here. If it plays its strategic cards right, the Communist Party of China will benefit greatly from seeing its two greatest strategic competitors, Russia and America, devour each other over a senseless border dispute in southern Europe, which is why Beijing is likely supporting Russia in its fight in Ukraine. Gog and Magog. Historians will look back with confusion as to how idiotic the leaders of this time were. They will note that the two speeches of the Russian and American presidents on the 1-year anniversary of the start of the Russo-Ukrainian War was the moment in which the conflict truly became a world war. What's more is they will wonder how people blessed with so much could have been so irresponsible as to throw it all away over a petty dispute. Face it, there will be no peace in our time. The recent speeches made by Biden and Putin, as well as the increasing involvement of China in the Ukraine conflict, mean that war is our lot, and this war is not the one that the West can easily win. So I'm not sure, I don't really feel like I have to defend my views or my thoughts on this, but I'm going to a little bit anyways. Going through some of the things that I've said during this episode, it might sound like I'm down with Russia or Putin, and it's not supposed to sound like that. I'm not down with Russia or Putin. I do believe that some of the things he says is true. I believe that America's run by pedophiles and Satanists. But I'm self-aware enough to also know that I don't think that we're the good guys in this. We, the royal we, the United States is necessarily being a good guy in this either. And on top of not necessarily thinking that we're the good guys in this, I believe that we're being very stupid. I believe that we're being very dumb in how we deal with this. And I look at our leaders and some of the things that they say and some of the things that they do, and you know, it seems like we're on this march, like momentum. We're being carried by the momentum of stupidity, and I agree with a lot of the stuff, especially in this last article about it's inevitable. Whatever is going to happen, it's inevitable. You know, I'm almost 50 years old, and I grew up in the 80s, before the wall fell, you know, before Mr. Gorbachev tear down this wall, which, you know, if you listen to the show enough, I believe that was the stone cold stunner of the Cold War when Reagan went to Berlin and said that. You know, I grew up being terrified of nuclear war. There was a percentage out there of people in America who, it was staggering. It was something like 60% or something like that of people who don't know what a nuclear winter is. And that's scary to me. We do this show to struggle to put these things in context sometimes, and I feel like people like me have let our hands off the wheel, and maybe we're going to pay the price. Maybe we're going to wind up paying the price for that. You know, that's the kind of shit I'm talking about. Unearned swagger. You know, if you haven't, I remember I was in middle school and I was terrified about this stuff, and you know, sleepless nights, laying there being like, is this gonna be it? You know, on the rare occasion where I go back and I look at like my sketchbooks and stuff from high school, or think about some of the art I did in high school, like nuclear mushroom clouds everywhere. And it's funny because now that I said that, I'm like, oh shit, like in my tarot card deck, one of the expansion cards, the Lust card, there's a nuclear explosion going on in the background. And then as I'm thinking about that, I'm like, oh shit, my second to last graphic novel I did, the Jin Jihad, there's a fucking mushroom cloud on the cover of that too. Like, it's ingrained, bro. It's ingrained. Anyhow, I'm John Towers. This has been the Abracast. I am struggling to get back on schedule, and also to get some continuity going. So this is the second episode in a row. I'm feeling a lot better, and so I will talk to you next week at the latest.
Thank you for listening, and we hope that you enjoyed the show. Please send an email or find us on social media and let us know what you think about the show. We would appreciate it if you would give us a 5-star rate and review wherever you find your favorite podcasts. You can find Stigmata Studios, graphic, novels, and comic books at Abracast.com. Welcome to the Red Archive. Get access to over 50 hours of archived episodes, more bonus audio, additional exclusive content. All this for only $1 a month. Find the link to the Red Archive at Abracast.com.